Welcome. Today we're going to be going through the Final Fantasy website and kind of taking a look at what each page of the flags does, what you want to be looking at as a newer player, as well as kind of going into a little bit more depth in just what the flag is, but like why you should care about it and what you're ultimately looking for. So this is version 4-2-3 of the Final Fantasy randomizer, so it will change a little bit if you're looking at this afterwards, but for the time being, this should be perfect for the upcoming Duckling Bootcamp that's starting in November 2021. Okay, so to begin, let's go start with a general overview of the page and what you're looking at. So, on the right here are a number of presets, and this is what you're going to see when you sign up for the first time. These presets, range from beginner to Spring Tournament 2021 pods. Generally speaking, if it's your first seed, the beginner one is a great place to start. But these basically just change the options for the games in these other tabs, and these are what we call flags. But we'll get into that in a second. On the left, some very critical things. You're going to have to make sure that you have a copy of the USA Final Fantasy 1 ROM. It should end in a .nes, and that's what you're going to need to upload. And once you upload it for the first time, click this Remember ROM so you don't need to keep doing it. So for me, it already says using Remembered ROM. Tournament safe ROM will only be on if you're in a tournament. Generating spoiler log will not be on if you're in a tournament. This is going to tell you where various items are. And hide flags is if you want to send a ROM to people without them being able to know what's happening. As you can see here, by clicking hide flags, they don't know what's going on and they can't actually see that. So that's what that does. But for your day-to-day, don't need to worry about that. Seed, this is the randomization seed, and this is basically what's going to select which version of the game, or not which version, sorry, what type of, this is going to change which locations are shuffled to where. So for example, if you always play with the same seed, your loot might always be at Bicky, but as soon as you change the seed, now all of a sudden that loot's going to go somewhere else. So the seed is important to just kind of have a different one each time you play, and you can randomize it just by clicking new a few times. And finally, the flags. This is what stores, this is basically an encoding of all of the things that are in these tabs on the right. So we'll get into that in a second. Moving on to the bottom part here. These flags are all fun percent or quality of life, and they do not, the fun percent flags do not change the ROM in a way that affects gameplay. It only affects music, colors, naming, things like that, and sprites. However, quality of life are various things that do slightly affect gameplay, some of them more so than others, like, for example, renouncing autosort and renounce chest info. Um, these do affect gameplay, slow map movement, but they're only in ways that would slow you down more than would speed you up. I guess the only one that's not like that is renouncing chest info. So these are ones that are known to not, you don't need to turn these on. So you can turn these on, though, if you don't like the way that certain things are set up to slow things down, like, for example, slowing down map movement. Um, for the time being, though, the two I want to highlight in here are the disable damage tile flicker and disable spellcast flash. So if you're going to be, oh, you can't see those. There you go. If you turn on disable damage tile flicker or disable spellcast flash, these are excellent things for streaming in case your viewers are flickering sensitive or various things like this. So I would recommend just always keeping these on, um, so that way when you stream, they're not an issue. If you're playing by yourself, though, of course, feel free to turn them off. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the general overview of the UI. Moving on to a tab by tab breakdown. So let's start with goal. Goal, of course, is how you're going to win the game. And there's a lot of different options here, but it's broken down into two main ways of playing. And one main way of playing is treasure hunt, which is located on the left. And then there's the standard way of playing, which is to have to get all the orbs instead. So let's start with all the orbs. So of course, in order to win Final Fantasy 1, you're going to need to retrieve 4 orbs from the 4 fiends that are located throughout the world. And that is the orb of air, fire, water, and earth. So, if you check nothing on this page, you're going to need to get all 4 orbs. You're going to need to have the key and the loot, which is what unlocked Topher would change, and you're going to need to go through all of the Temple of Fiends revisited. Now, these flags on the left change various parts of that. So, for example, free orbs means you don't need to get all 4 orbs. Hitting chaos means that you must defeat chaos you must defeat chaos without going into the Temple of Fiends Revisited at all. So this is quite different and not really a standard way of playing, but something that's interesting. Alternate final boss changes who the final boss is. So there's a number of options here, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on all of them, but you can find some more information on the left over here. And once again, for any of these flags, you can always click the question mark to go through it in a little bit more detail and get some more information. But the key one here is free orbs. That's the one you're going to be seeing the most frequently, maybe even during the Duckling Derby. It's not super common, but definitely something that occurs. Okay, moving into very frequent flags that you'll see. Temple of Fiends one. So Unlock Topher makes it so that you do not require the key. For some reason in the vanilla game, this door in the Temple of Fiends requires the key. And even if you shorten Topher, which we'll get to in a second, it still requires the key to make sure that you have it. This flag turns that requirement off, so you could win without the key. Topher exit does something relatively minor, so I'll touch on that next. It basically makes it so that this exit portal appears. So when you break the orb to go into the past, you can always just jump out without the need of warp or exit. Okay. Another small one is adding Chaos Floors encounters. So normally the Chaos Floor does not have encounters, but this adds them. These are the encounters that can occur. Once again, very minimal impact on gameplay. But relatively large impact on gameplay is Shorten Topher. So normally the Temple of Fiends Revisited, which is what Topher stands for, is a multi-floor, multi-dungeon experience that takes quite a bit of time. With a black belt, maybe 6-7 minutes, but most seeds it'll take 8-9 minutes even. So shortening Topher moves you immediately onto the Chaos Floor. That is what this flag does. It moves you immediately onto the Chaos Floor, plus provides you with all the chests that are normally located in the Temple of Fiends Revisited immediately. Note that in this diagram, you still require the loot to get past the loot, and if the Unlock Topher isn't on, you will require the key for this door right here. Now, in the base version of this, you do not have to fight any fiends. You only need to fight Chaos. However, if you click Include Fiend Tiles, this is going to spawn 2 fiends on each side. So there's going to be 2 on the left and 2 on the right, and they're going to be random fiends. So you could end up fighting Lich and Carry, the first 2 bosses, which would be relatively easy, or you could end up fighting Tiamat and Kraken, which would be not so good. You could also fight them in any order, etc., etc. Pretty common here to reset if you get like Tiamat first to go down the other side. Just a small note. And then refight all fiends instead makes it so that all 4 fiends are on the tiles. So as you can see here, Lich, then Carry, then Kraken, then Tiamat. So you can't avoid any fights. And this is basically the boss rush Topher. So fight all 4 bosses and then Chaos and then go win. So that covers the fiend fights and the final boss and the Temple of Fiends. Moving on to Treasure Hunt. This is an alternate way to basically represent the orbs that you're getting. So instead of needing to collect 4 orbs, instead you're going to need to find shards in order to break the black orb. And that's going to be turned on by enabling Treasure Hunt. So if you do this, the number of shards that you're going to need to collect ranges from 16 to 36, and these are random generated ranges. Oh, you can actually see that. Okay, so the drop down has exactly 16, exactly 20, 24, 28, 32, so on and so forth. Here's what the range looks like, for example. But this basically says how many you need to collect. And now, key note here is not only are they found in random chests, they're also found by killing, or more accurately, by lighting orbs in where they would be in the vanilla game. So, for example, lighting the orb of Earth will grant you 2 shards, fire 2 shards. Water and air will grant you 4 shards. So just keep that in mind, because that always means that you have 12 shards that are just accessible by beating bosses if you know where they are and how to defeat them. So this really changes the orb condition. And then the final one is very funky, which is Lich's Revenge. It basically makes Lich the end boss. So I'm not going to get too much into this. This was part of the Halloween special 2020. But yeah, if you want some more information on that, go check out the VOD. So yeah, that's the goal page in a nutshell. One last thing I want to touch on before I move on to the next one is what these various things mean. So check means on, this means off. Question mark makes it a chance for it to be on. And basically, when the seed is rolled, you don't know whether hitting chaos is on or not. I would not recommend this for things like that you can't check, like hitting Chaos, for example, is pretty miserable. Same thing with like Unlock Topher. However, for some of the other flags that you'll see down below, it can be pretty fun to turn on Tristate, especially ones that you can like actually check if they're on or not. So like Northern Docks, for example, which we'll get to in a little bit. Okay, so that wraps up the gold portion of it. Moving on to scale. So scale basically adjusts difficulty. It does a couple other random things too, but basically anything that requires scales is on this page. But the key ones you're going to be using it for are gold, enemies, encounter rate, and experience. Okay, so gold, very straightforward. This is how expensive things cost. This is items, this is the shop item, and this is spells. So keep all those in mind because they do matter a lot, especially spells. So these sliders, a couple notes before we get into them in too much detail. This is the minimum number it can roll. This is the maximum number it can roll, and this is the median number that it will roll. So it's on a distribution with the median at 94%. So just do keep that in mind. This is not an average of 94%. The way it works is it's yeah, I'm not going to get into the math of it, but just know that the median is very important. So this is not an equal chance of rolling everything from 30 to 390. And like 31% does not have the change chance as 32%, which has the same chance as 33%. In general, for this slider, I would recommend keeping it at 300. 30 to 300 is perfect. Maybe a little bit lower on the upper end if you want. And if you go a little lower on the upper end, I would also recommend bumping the lower end up a little bit to get the average pretty close to 100%. So 50, or the median to 100%. So 50 to 200% also is very nice. Wrap overflowing prices. Basically, it just wraps. I don't know why you would really turn this on, but basically instead of if an item gets higher than 65,000, it would wrap back to 1 gold instead of just getting capped out, but I would almost never turn this on. Scale starting gold. So this will let you start with more or less gold depending on what this rolls as, and that's pretty important. It's uncommon. This is a relatively new flag, but something that you can take a look at. Next is excluding gold. So this will make it so that gold treasures will only roll to plus or minus 10% of their vanilla value. It also removes the flat gold bonus. So basically you get gold at almost exactly the same as vanilla. If you do this, you may very strongly want to consider making the vendor item guaranteed to be cheap so you don't get stuck with no money. And finally, this is a flat gold boost. So this reapplies the flat gold boost, and it ideally makes gold grinds more satisfying. This isn't that important though. So once again, most of the time, nothing on here will be checked, and you're just going to be modifying the prices scaling. Like most things on the Final Fantasy randomizer, there's a lot of information out here, and there's a lot of stuff, but I wouldn't go into too much detail on all of this. Okay, moving into enemy stats and boss stats. This is probably the most important thing alongside encounter rates to check on this page, and EX experience. So these next sections are by far the most important things to check. So always, always, always make sure that you're checking this page out. So enemy stats first. Enemy stats are the scaling on their HP, their hit rate, their miss rate, etc., etc., etc. But each of them are scaled independently. So you may have an enemy with 200% of their HP, but 50% of their damage, but 200% of their attacks, and 175% of their evasion, and so on and so forth. So keep that in mind. It's not going to roll one value, and also each enemy is rolled independently. So every single value is randomized independently on this range. Now, the only exception to that is if you turn on separate HP scaling. This is going to make it so that the HP is rolled separately from the stats. So the stats are going to be attack, defense, or attack, absorb, number of hits, things like that. But their HP will be rolled on this like 100 to 200% scale, for example. Sometimes you'll see people use the word clamped. This is because of an older flag set where if you just wanted to set it to 100%, there was another checkbox, but nowadays you just use the sliders. But 100% is generally, base is generally just called clamped HP. This is pretty brutal, by the way. Be very, very careful if you're making flags about clamping enemy HP, because like 141% median is no joke. Okay, on to the next one. Boss stats. So bosses are rolled independently of enemy stats. Keep in mind when you're making flags or reading flags that this includes early game bosses, like Garland, for example. And clamping Garland at, 200% and 200% HP can be quite unfun. So do be very, very careful with this. Just keep that in mind. And it's worked the exact same. Bosses are rolled independently of enemies, and you can set the HP stat separately. Okay, I'm going to skip over this for a second, and then we're going to go over encounter rates experience and then come back. So encounter rates are very important concepts to understand. It is how frequently you're going to get random encounters on the overworld or on the dungeon. Now, overworld actually has two different zones. There's land overworld and there's ship overworld. So keep that in mind. Pretty standard encounter rates are 0.6 and 0.7. The reason 0.6 and 0.7 work is because it makes it so there's the same number of encounters on the, or sorry, encounters occur in the same places on both the overworld and the dungeon. So that's one reason. Actually, this is a little bit strange. It's not this. Let's go to this. Yeah, okay, I guess it is. That seems a bit odd to me. But anyways, yeah, so this makes it so that encounters occur in the same places. Yeah. So, for example, the ship has 3 encounters per 256 steps, and that would be impacted by the overworld encounter rate, so it would go down to 2. Dungeons encounters, on the other hand, have different encounter rates than the overworld, so just keep that in mind, and this really does make a big difference. Most players do not prefer to play at vanilla, which is 1.0. It's quite encounter heavy. Most people play a little bit lower. Personally, I think anywhere in the point, 0.6 to 0.8 range is all pretty good. Any lower than 0.6, and I find that you might as well have very few encounters as resources are no longer a concern. And any more than like 0.9 and vanilla is not super fun. Okay, moving into EXP and gold boost. So this is a little bit of a complicated section. It's important to recognize what each of these different values are doing. So experience boost is actually a divider. That's more complicated than it sounds, but the way it basically works is instead of it multiplying the amount of EXP that you're getting, because that can cause overflows, it actually divides the amount of EXP you need to get a level. It does the same thing, but just keep that in mind, so that if you know how much an enemy gives in vanilla and you're not seeing 2.3 times that, that's the reason why. The gold boost is a flat gold boost per enemy scaled by this multiplier on each enemy. So this is how much, yeah. So this one, and also this is how much EXP extra that you're going to be getting as well. This is going to increase, basically the second slider is going to increase the amount of early game experience you're going to make, and the top slider is going to increase the amount of EXP you're going to get in the late game more so, because ones with higher base values are going to get more impacted by the EXP scale, and ones with more numbers of enemies or lower base values are going to get impacted more by the flat scaling. So yeah, that's pretty important to understand. For beginners, somewhere in the 2.3 to 2.8 range, maybe upwards up to three times is pretty good. For competitive flag sets, I would recommend 2.2 to 2.5 plus like 150 or something like that is pretty solid. So somewhere in like this range. Okay, EXP and gold progressive scaling. This basically changes the way that, or how much extra EXP and gold you get, depending on some items or on some factors. So the most standard one is per key item you obtain. So this is 5% per key item. But there's other ones, like, for example, a flat boost up 150% at 12 key items, or bonuses per orb or 8 shards. So these are all different ways to play. Most people either play with 5% per item on. 20% is a lot, by the way, so keep that in mind. Or just disabling it is also totally fine. Okay, jumping back to some of the less commonly used flags. Evade cap values basically change the way that enemies how high their evade can roll. It can be extremely annoying to play against enemies with captivation if you don't have access to lock. So we usually cap it at 240. You can change the setting, but I would not recommend changing this. Once again, this is the same thing as gold, where if an enemy stat would go too high, it would go back to 1 and then progress instead of just getting capped at the maximum. Once again, very uncommon. And finally, this changes the chance that enemy can, or this adds in the enemy's morale to the stat scaling, which means that enemies can have a higher probability of running away, or lower in some cases. Once again, very uncommon, but you can take a look at that. Okay, moving into the experience. These flags are very impactful, and there are certain flag sets that are they're benefited quite a bit by this, especially ones with recruitment. So nuns gain EXP makes it so that nun characters count as alive characters. And this is good if you want to have a flag set where people pick up more characters along the way, but they don't want to have to regrind those characters independently. The annoying part about this is if you want to play two-person for the whole flag set, you're splitting your EXP anyways, and that's not great. So just make sure you use this carefully. Dead's gain EXP is the much worse version of Nun's gain EXP if you want to let a character die to let them grow, or sorry, to make other characters grow faster. However, it's the good version of it if you want to make a very forgiving flag set where everyone gains levels equally. Um, these can also be used in tandem or not at all. For example, if you turn on Nun's gain EXP, it allows people to distribute EXP by picking up a character starting with 4, but then when they, most commonly starting with 2 and then recruiting, but then once they recruit, if they let another character die off, then that character is no longer siphoning EXP. So this is actually a pretty solid way to play if you're playing with Tavern mode on, which we'll get to later. Dead's gain EXP, on the other hand, is the opposite. If you want to play with a smaller party, you have to take a smaller party at the beginning. But if you want to play with your full party, you're guaranteed that all your people are going to get levels equally. I recommend playing with both of them off, unless you're doing Tavern mode. Okay, and the last one is EXP chest conversion. So this basically determines how many chests containing gold are going to have EXP instead. So this slider goes from 0 to 100%. You can have a range. In this case, it will select randomly. And also how much EXP is going to be in those chests. That's pretty much all it is to it. This is still a relatively new flag, not super common, but it is an interesting way to play. And it can cut down on grinding in exchange for more chest opening, which has interesting gameplay implications. So for example, you can play like fighter comps where you can open more chests for gear or EXP, and that way you don't need to grind, which could be pretty nice. Might be interesting in Shard Hunt, Entrance Floor. There's lots of different options for this for the future. Okay, moving on to the next tab. So this is probably one of the most important tabs out here. These top few, of course, are all extremely important, but incentives is very different than other randomizers if you've ever played them before. So the way incentive locations and items work is as follows. So first, you need to figure out how many of each you have. There's 3 concepts in Final Fantasy Randomizer that are important to understand before we get into this page at all. There are no loose flag sets, there are dud item flag sets, and there are loose item flag sets. So to begin, what's a loose item? A loose item is an item that you do not know where it's located. So for example, if you have more items than known locations, some of those items are going to be distributed to unknown locations. So for example, if I turned on Canoe here, I would have 21 items. Oops. If I turned on Masa here, I would have 21 items and 20 locations. And that would mean that one of these items is not going to be in one of these chests that I understand. Let's move to something a little bit more sane. Here we go. So if I turned on the Excalibur being incentivized, that means that one of these items is going to be located in a location I don't know, which means it could be in literally any box in the game. That is what a loose item is. The community goes back and forth on whether loose items are good or not, but that is what loose items mean. So if we have 2 loose, it will be because the number of items is 2 higher than the number of locations. That's what a loose item is. A dud item, on the other hand, is the opposite. If we turn off these items, that means that we now have 19 items for 21 locations, which means 2 of these incentive locations, which are known chests, because it says placement vanilla, that means 2 of them will contain items that we don't know about. So they'll be like heal pods or gold or other things like that. And this is called dud items. So let's go through that again. When items are greater than locations, you have loose items. When locations are greater than items, you have dud items. And finally, if they are equal, then this means no loose, which means every single one of the chests on the left, or NPCs, will have one of the items on the right. And this is probably the most common way to play right now. But just keep this in mind. So understanding these concepts is really important. And then we're going to tweak that a bunch. So one way that some people have been playing recently, for example, is all loose. And that is if you turn everything off. And this is going to be very similar to how most people play something like Link to the Past randomizer, where every single chest has an equal chance, or not an equal chance, but can contain progression. So you basically need to open up all the boxes until you have enough for go mode, and then you can stop opening boxes. But you don't know where any of your key items are, for sure. You just know that the game's beatable, so you can follow logic based off of that. Okay, so let's kind of go through. Oh, the last thing I want to talk about is this placement thing. So this is a relatively new feature to the randomizer introduced in the last year, but basically what you can do is you can change the placement from vanilla to random. And this means that there will be a key item in this dungeon, but you don't know which chest in this dungeon will have it. So you know that Ice Cave will have, in this case, exactly one incentive item because there's no loose. But you don't know which chest will have it. So this is an interesting way to make it so people can only half clear a dungeon or clear until they find the item and not have to full clear everything looking for loose, which is kind of cool. Um, do note I really, really, really don't recommend playing with loose items and placement being random because now there may be one or two items in Ice Cave because you don't know if you found the loose item or the incentivized item, so don't do that. Some of these have secondary options. So for example, Earth Cave has random, but it also has before gating and behind gating. And this, of course, means before the rod and after the rod. So keep that in mind. Same thing with Sea Shrine. Before gating means any chest except for the ones that are locked with the key. And behind gating means the ones that are locked with the key. And finally, Sky Palace. Now, of course, Sky Palace is locked twice, but you need the chime to get into Sky Palace anyways, or the Sky Palace actually is Sky Palace and Mirage Tower. So basically before gating means it's in Mirage, and behind gating means it's behind the cube, so in Sky Palace. So yeah, these are really, really cool flags. Now, if you're going to play with loose, this is a really good flag to turn on. What this does is if you play with this, will be no loose items in incentivized dungeons. And this gets rid of the problem I was saying before. So you could turn on random, or you could just keep it vanilla. And this means that people will know when a dungeon needs to be cleared more or not. And that's really, really interesting. So that's what the no loose items in incentive dungeons does. It only matters if there are more items than locations, once again. Yeah, I guess I'm not going to go through each of those locations. If you want to find some more information on them, just click the question mark, or check out the auto tracker. It has them all in there on Emo Tracker as well. Main NPCs, fetch quest NPCs. And the final thing I want to discuss on this page are the hints. So hints are hint givers that are located in certain locations. They will tell you the location of one of the items that you've checked. There's also ones that you can enable in Dungeon, and this turns on whammy hints, so hints that are useless. So that's what those do. This is an interesting one to turn on Tristate because people can check pretty quickly if the hint givers are turned on or not. So I like this for Tristate potentially. Yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up this page. I did want to note that almost all flag sets these days, main NPCs and fetch quest NPCs are on. Main progression items, other quest items are on. There's been some playing around with having guaranteed loose movement progression, but in general, these top 5 are all turned on, and then some combination of locations to make sure that there's no loose is the most common. So, let's just start with the standard set, like this. And then let's say I have a particular liking to go to Marsh Cave, Ice Cave. I always like Incentive Volcano, and I have one more, so I'm going to turn on something that's relatively small, like Cardio Locked. I'm going to make it so that they're always in random locations in each of these dungeons. And there we go. This would be like a pretty typical flag set. Maybe another take would be something like all of these being vanilla, but we're going to turn on no loose items in incentivized dungeons. And then we're going to increase the number of items so there's a couple loose items. So something like this. So yeah, pretty interesting. Oh, one final note. I would recommend against turning on the ribbon, even though there's fanfares and things like that. Having ribbons with loose items is kind of questionable because there's 3 ribbons, so it can be hard to know which one you found. So I would not recommend that. Yeah, that's it for incentives. Let's move on to maps. So for maps, we're going to be going through the various options that are available to change the map around. So the I'm going to actually start away from Engine Shuffle and start with the overworld changes. So overworld early open progression. This adds two critical adjustments. One is that you can walk from Canaria to Dwarf Cave, and the second is that you can canoe from Ice Cave to Volcano, or the Crescent Lake area. This is almost always on because it increases the early game progression opportunities. Extended open progression does even more. This allows for you to walk from Canaria all the ways to Marsh Cave and Elfland without the need for any additional transportation. This is on some of the time, but always, always, always check these flags. Northern Docks adds Northern Docks so that you can get to Sea Shrine and the Sky Palace, or Mirage, with only the ship and the canal. So this is a pretty major change and something that you really need to keep in mind for logical reasons. The number of times that people have forgotten about, like Waterfall Robot, for example, because they didn't check Northern Docks is astounding. So please, please, please check this flag as well. Ryukin Desert Dock allows you to get the floater without the canoe. Or sorry, more accurately, use the floater to get the airship without the canoe. So this also changes logic drastically, so always check if this dock is on. So these are the older flags. Some other ones that are a little bit less common but relatively new are all ones in similar vein. They basically allow access to locations that were previously floater locked. So for example, this allows access to Bahamut with just the ship and the canal. This allows access to Lefane with the canoe, the ship, and the canal. And this allows access to Gaia if you also turn on the Lefane River dock with the canoe, the ship, and the canal. So yeah, that's what these flags all do here. And these are very important to check. So always, always, always check if these are on or not. Okay, moving into progression. Early King item, early Sarda item, early Sages item, and early Ordeals all changes the vanilla requirements to get these items. So early King allows it to be accessed from the beginning of the game instead of you needing to rescue Princess Sarah first. This almost never is used, but actually there's an exception for Entrance Floor, but or sorry, is almost always like turned on, but people rarely check the King first. However, if Entrance Floor is on, this is pretty important. Early Sarda item allows you to get the item before you kill the vampire in Earth Cave. This is once again almost always turned on. Early Sage allows you to get their item without the Earth Orb being lit, and once again this is almost always on. And Early Ordeals allows you to go to Ordeals without the crown and is almost always on. So those, if one of these is unchecked though, please, please, please pay attention. This is the type of thing where you're looking more if it's unchecked than if it's checked. Okay, moving into dungeons. We'll get to towns later. Sky Castle, this changes the way that Sky 4 is randomized. I would almost never recommend changing it, but you can do it if it floats your boat. Castle Ordeals pillars, this changes the vanilla order. So if you don't turn on this randomization, people can just memorize the pillar order. But if you do, then people are going to have to guess and check. Warp helps a lot. Titan's Trove changes where the Titan is located. The reason this is important is because if this is turned off, you can actually access the Titan Trove incentive item right here without the ruby. So this change makes it so that you cannot, regardless of if you have the airship or the ruby. So you need the ruby to access it, and this is almost always checked. Dragon's Hoard makes it so that all the Cardi incentive chests are in one location, so you don't have to hop between them. Yeah. Hall of Dragons. This makes it so that this hallway is filled with dragons instead of having no encounters. So kind of similar to the encounters on the Chaos Floor. It adds encounters where there originally was none. And PropGen Waterfall, another evil flag, makes it so that Waterfall Cave is procedurally generated, and you'll have to find your way to the Waterfall Robot by guess and check. Once again, this is the most common setup of it. If you see this, this is normal. If anything changes, you have to pay special attention. The last one in here is flipping dungeons horizontally. Yeah, this is a flag that exists. It really messes up your muscle memory. Okay. two more locations on here, towns. This makes it so that Melmond has encounters. This makes it so that Melmond always has an inn, or sorry, a clinic, um, whereas normally it doesn't because the vampire destroyed it in the vanilla game. This flag makes it so that the old men walk around, which is mostly annoying. Um, Add Gaia shortcut makes it so that you can walk from the bottom up to the Gaia magic shops and the fairy location without having to go all the ways around. So this is a nice convenience flag. I think it's going to become more important, or not important, it's going to become more popular in the future. Moving the Gaia item shop makes it so that you can access the Gaia item shop without going all the ways to the left as well. Lefene's hospitality is almost always turned on and makes it so that there's both an inn and a clinic in Lefene. And Lefane Superstore is an interesting flag, mostly used in Deep Dungeon, but it makes it so that all of the magic shops are located in Lefane. Now, it does not include the level 7 and 8 magic shops from Gaia, but this is a good way to stock up on all of your magic that you might have missed. Finally, Vampire Attacks Random Town makes it so that one of the towns has been attacked by the vampire and removes the item shop and clinic from it, but it also means Melmond has a chance to be spared. And this includes Canary. I would very strongly not recommend this unless you don't want any magic to start. And finally, entrance shuffle. So this is a very large change to the way that it works, but basically does what you would expect. So entrances shuffles all entrances except for towns. But this will mean that you may go to Temple of Fiends on the vanilla map, and it will start Volcano. But it means that Volcano will be Volcano in its entirety. You may go to Matoya, and it might be the Elf Castle, so on and so forth. But they will be their entire dungeons, all in one location. Allow unsafe start makes it so that there's not one guaranteed safe location near the beginning of the game. Include dead ends shuffles the cardio locations that are dead ends in the vanilla game. Now, keep in mind, this also means that the cardio locations that are dead ends in the vanilla game, which you probably are not used to checking, now will have entrances at them that you might need to check. So don't forget to check like small cardia or the second thing in cardia double with Bahamut. Okay, before we get into floors, let's talk about towns. So towns shuffles all the towns amongst themselves. So with the current setup right now, all the entrances will be shuffled and all the towns will be shuffled. But Canary will always be Canaria. But Elfland might be Provoca, and Provoca might be Gaia, and so on and so forth. But it will not shuffle the towns and the entrances together unless you click mix all entrances together. And now the towns and entrances will all be shuffled together. So for example, Temple of Fiends might be Provoca, and Provoca might be Volcano, and so on and so forth. Including Canary includes Canary in the town shuffle. I would not recommend turning this on, but you can. And finally, another somewhat common combination is entrance floor town shuffle. This means that all of the floors are shuffled as well. So an entrance will lead to a floor. That floor, if it has an exit, will lead to a different floor, and they're all shuffled together. If Deep Towns is not on, towns will always be located at the top level. And if Deep Topher is not on, Topher will also always be located at the top level. So these rules are helpful for if you're looking for Topher or looking for towns. However, if you turn on Deep Topher, now all of a sudden Topher can be 10 floors deep. And if you turn on Deep Towns, well, now all of a sudden Provoca might be below Volcano 1, which is below Sea Split, which is below a bunch of stuff. So pretty nasty. There are a couple other rules about entrance floor that you should be aware of. So Ordeals is always an entrance. It can't be located deep down. Ice Cave is always the bottom part of Ice Cave. So basically from the drop downs combined are always together. And yeah, that's pretty much